tough time for them because we've all had to go through with a pandemic. But I ask us all to think of the children of Ukraine, 2/3 of whom have been driven from their homes. 2/3. And who have seen nearly 1/5 of their schools destroyed or damaged. And yet, working by candlelight or in makeshift classrooms, 7,500 of them have achieved the highest possible grades. And I think it's our collective mission to ensure that those brilliant students grow up to use their qualifications to achieve their dreams in a peaceful, prosperous, and independent Ukraine. And I believe that they will, because out of the ashes of your towns and cities, out of the monstrous scars that are being left by Putin's missiles, something beautiful is blooming, and it's a flower that the whole world can see and admire. And that is the unconquerable will of the Ukrainians to resist. And that is what Putin failed to understand. He simply had no idea how much Ukrainians love this extraordinary country with its rich black soil and magical golden domes, how much they treasure the life and the bustle and the freedom and the Eurovision Song Contest winning cultural dynamism of Ukraine. And just as he fatally underestimated Ukraine, he also underestimated the price the world was willing to pay to support Ukraine. We have and we will, and even though we must accept that after 6 months of war, the price is indeed a high price. And I've come from the United Kingdom, where we're battling inflation that is being driven by the spike in energy prices that is caused by Putin's war. And we face strikes being driven by trade unions' bosses who have the ruinous belief that the best way to tackle soaring energy prices is with ever higher wages, when that is, of course, simply to pour petrol on the flames. And of course, we're doing everything we can to deal with the pressures people face in their cost of living and to help people through the difficult months ahead. And that's why, given what's happening across the world, Volodymyr, it's so important for you to know now that we in Britain have the strength and the patience to get through these economic difficulties that have been so recklessly driven and exacerbated by the folly and malevolence of one man, Vladimir Putin. And like every other European country, we're of course working to end our dependence on Russian hydrocarbons. We're building those new nuclear power stations, one a year rather than one every 10 years, tens of gigawatts of new wind farms. And I can tell you that we in the UK will not for 1 second give in to Putin's economic blackmail. Because the people of my country can see with complete clarity what is at stake in Ukraine today. Yes, of course, it's about you and your right to live in peace and freedom. And frankly, that on its own is enough. But it's also about all of us who believe in the principles of freedom and democracy. And here today in Ukraine, I believe that history is at a turning point. After decades in which democracy has been on the defensive, on the back foot, we have an opportunity to join you in saying no to tyranny, saying no to those who would stifle Ukrainian liberty and independence, and we will. And that is why Ukraine will win. And we also know that if we're paying in our energy bills for the evils of Vladimir Putin, the people of Ukraine are paying in their blood. And that's why we know we must stay the course. Because if Putin were to succeed, then no country on Russia's perimeter would be safe, and if Putin succeeds, it would be a great in the world, a signal that borders can be changed by force. And, Volodymyr, that's why the British House of Commons, all parties, stood as one to applaud you and to support the military, diplomatic and economic support that we are giving to Ukraine. And I'm proud that we've already supplied more arms than any other European country, including 6,900 anti-tank missiles, 5,000 of the NLAWs, 120 armoured vehicles, Starstreak anti-aircraft missiles, anti-ship missiles, and now, of course, the MLRS. And today I can tell you that more artillery, more ammunition is on its way, and 2,000 UAVs. We're also training 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers alongside our allies. And the other day I was at Catterick in Yorkshire, and I met 400 of your recruits that we are helping to train. And these were people from all walks of life, people who weren't soldiers yet, who'd never been to battle before. But the grim reality was that just in a few weeks from now, they are heading to that front line. And when I listened to their cheerfulness and their courage, I knew that Ukraine will win. And in offering this kind of training and equipment, I also want to applaud our friends and allies around the world. In the EU, the Poles, the Baltic countries, the Dutch, the Czechs, the French, the Germans, the Italians, they've been steadfast. But at this juncture, it would be right to pay a special tribute to the outstanding global leadership of the United States of America. And let me be clear, I believe the commitment by the United States of $40 billion in military support, I think about $59 billion all told, has been indispensable to Ukraine's success. And I thank Joe Biden and his team for what they've been doing. And to all our friends, I simply say this: we must keep going. We must show, as friends of Ukraine, that we have the same strategic endurance as the people of Ukraine. We know that the coming winter will be tough and that Putin will manipulate Russian energy supplies to try to torment households across Europe. And our first test as friends of Ukraine will be to face down and endure that pressure, to help consumers, but also to build up our own supplies. And I believe that as we come through this winter, our position will strengthen. And with every week, a month that goes by, Putin's position will weaken and his leverage will diminish. And that's why now we must continue and intensify our support for Ukraine. The HIMARS, the MLRS, the systems that are proving so effective in Ukrainian hands. We can't afford for one moment to relax the sanctions on Putin. We've got to keep up the financial and economic support for Ukraine. And every day around the world, we must fight Putin's lies, because it's his war that's pushing up the price of food and oil and gas, and not Western sanctions. And we must fight any creeping attempt to normalize relations with Putin, because it's becoming ever clearer that thanks to the sacrifice and the bravery of the people of Ukraine, the vaunted Russian offensive in the Donbass is failing. And therefore, this is exactly the moment for your friends to help you strike the Russians just as they begin to wobble. We know that Putin's troops are towering, that his losses are colossal and his supply lines are vulnerable. We can see how tiny his recent advances have become and how huge the cost in Russian blood and Russian treasure has been, tragically, in the tears of Russian mothers. And we also know that this is not the time to advance some flimsy plan for negotiation with someone who is simply not interested. You can't negotiate with a bear while it's eating your leg, and you can't negotiate with a street robber who has pinned you to the floor. And we don't need to worry, by the way, about humiliating Putin any more than we need to worry about humiliating a bear or a street robber. All that matters is restoring and preserving the sovereign integrity of Ukraine. And on this anniversary, let's remember that glorious day, 31 years ago, when on an 84% turnout, 92% supported independence. Den Zelensky. That's what it is. And this is now a war for that independence. And history teaches us that when a country has a language, an identity, a pride, a love of its traditions, a patriotic feeling that simply grows with every month and year that passes, when a country of that kind is engaged in a war for its very existence, I tell you, my friends, that war is only going to end one way. Ukraine will win, and Britain will be by your side. You have reminded us of values that the world thought it had forgotten. You've reminded us that freedom and democracy are worth fighting for. I'm proud to call myself a friend of Ukraine. I thank you for the honor that you've done me today, and you can count on me and my country in the years ahead. Thank you all very much, and Slava Ukraini!
Героям слава!
Героям слава, шановні колеги.
Вибачте, будь ласка, до колег, я хочу додати тільки декілька слів, що було дуже небезпечно на початку моєї промови одразу вручити нагороду Борису. Я не зміг продовжити свою промову і заяву. Борис одразу почав говорити і показати свою позицію і вдячність, і, в принципі, Борис про все сказав. Так і є. Він сказав головні речі. Це велика повага наша до Британії за всю допомогу, велика повага британського суспільства до наших українців, до міцності. Хочу сказати, що ми обговорили багато речей. І чим відрізняється лідер Джонсон від деяких лідерів тим, що ми розпочинали всі ці місяці нашу роботу з діалогу, а потім конкретні висновки з цих діалогів, з його запитання. Деякі лідери, вони говорять, ми вже стільки зробили, що ви ще від нас хочете. Прем'єр-міністр Джонсон завжди говорив, що ще Британія може зробити для України, для того, щоб вона перемогла, а вона точно переможе. Я думаю, це головний зміст відносин Великої Британії і України, відносин наших суспільств і поваги, і дружніх відносин між нами. Мені здається, що це найголовніше, що відбулося між нашими державами. І це також не дає нам право програти в цій війні. Ми точно її не програємо з такими друзями. Я хотів подякувати за те, що ви з нами сьогодні. Цей день важливий для нас, головний день. Хтось сказав, що у нас багато різних свят, але хто сьогодні мене привітав з особистим українським святом. Так воно і є. Це особисте наше українське свято, яке стало вже міжнародним, тому що дійсно вболівають багато людей, вболівають за Україну, за українську незламність. І вчора було також, дякую тобі за вчора, і всім лідерам хотів подякувати. Біля 60 країн вчора підтримали нашу кримську платформу, і більшість цих лідерів дійсно нам також дуже сильно допомагають в перемозі над ворогом в цій війні за нашу свободу і незалежність. І тут, безумовно, також підкреслюю той факт, що ти сказав, Борисе, в своїй промові, що ми вдячні за лідерську позицію підтримці України Сполученим Штатам Америки. Ще раз дякую тобі.
Так, шановні колеги, є можливість поставити кілька запитань. Давайте почнемо з української преси, з РБК.
Мілан Ліліч, РБК Україна. Я маю запитання і до пана президента, і до пана прем'єр-міністра. Чи бачите ви хоча б якийсь ризик того, що в осяжній перспективі під впливом російської пропаганди, енергетичного шантажу, зміни суспільної думки в європейських країнах, підхід Заходу до російсько-української війни зміниться? І знову замість розповідей про необхідність обов'язкової перемоги, мілітарної розгрому Російської Федерації, почнуться розмови про необхідність якихось болючих компромісів. І, можливо, які країни Європи в цьому сенсі можуть стати найбільш поступливими?
Борис,
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And people always say there's a risk that the West will start to fracture and that our unity will crumble. But I can tell you that I've recently been at the G7 summits at NATO, and that they said that in the run-up to those meetings, and actually the people of Ukraine is overwhelming, and I think it will endure. And I'll tell you why, because of the logic of the position that we're in, because there is no negotiation that is on offer. Vladimir Putin is not even offering a negotiation, and even if he were, it's hard to see how the people of Ukraine could negotiate under current circumstances. And secondly, people can see very clearly that conceding to aggression and tyranny in Ukraine would be a disaster for the world. And that's why it's been very, very remarkable that in spite of the difficulties, in spite of the adverse economic circumstances, we are determined to get through it. And we will come through it stronger, by the way, because we will no longer be vulnerable to the blackmail of Putin's hydrocarbons. Europe will have weaned itself off dependence on Putin's oil and gas. And that will be a massive geopolitical change, a disaster for Russia, by the way. But that's the end result. So that's why I made my point about the Putin's position weakening over time, and I think that the leverage that he has will diminish. So yes, it's going to be a tough few months, and yes, we will have to continue to explain to our populations why it's tough and why we've got to get through it, but we will get through it, and I think we will get through it united.
Дуже дякую. Я не знаю, що я можу додати до слів прем'єр-міністра. Я можу сказати, що міцність у світі залежить перш за все від нас, від нашої міцності. Впевнений, міцність всередині нашої держави на самому початку вторгнення продемонструвала всьому світові, як це бути об'єднаним. Ми всі об'єдналися. Мені здається, цей сигнал найголовніший, і його не можна втратити, і нікому не можна дати таку навіть можливість ззовні або всередині це робити. Цей сигнал, він завжди, його бачать люди, його бачать на полі бою, бачать, що таке сильна об'єднана держава з армією, з суспільством, всі борються. І навіть трішечки соромно стає тим чи іншим країнам, які повністю тебе не підтримували, тому що бачать, що їх суспільство підтримує. І це дуже важливо. Мені здається, не втратити підтримку суспільств різних держав не можна ні в якому сенсі. І це дуже важливо. І я повністю погоджуюсь, буде складно. І інформаційні атаки Росії на ті чи інші держави, на ті чи інші суспільства складно. Опалювальний сезон тощо складно впроваджувати 8-й пакет санкційної політики, тому що це вже грає і на політику всередині інших держав, перш за все Європейського Союзу. Тому що вони тут, вони розуміють, що відбувається, і нам з вами потрібно їх об'єднана позиція. Це не говорити з Великобританією або зі Сполученими Штатами. Тут трішки складніше, хоча є в Євросоюзі, ми знаємо, більшість держав, які так само на такому високому моральному рівні підтримують Україну. Тому це втратити не можна. Не можна розслаблятися, не можна заморозити конфлікти, не можна сказати, давайте почекаємо рік, два, три, і почнемо говорити. Все це наша буде слабкість. Нам не можна ні в якому разі віддати ініціативу. Інформаційно, через енергетичні ризики, через, ще раз повторюсь, опалювальний сезон, ядерний шантаж, блокування Чорного моря, загрози голоду, тощо для багатьох країн через все це можна втратити ініціативу. Україна не має права втратити ініціативу і не має дати можливості Європі втратити ініціативу. Сьогодні весь світ виграв ініціативу у Російській Федерації. І перемога наша в цій війні – це саме велике це об'єднання і неможливість втрати цієї ініціативи.
Далі, будь ласка, BBC.
James Waterhouse, BBC. Mr. President, I was wondering if I could get your reflections on this significant day for Ukraine. Just how independent do you think your country is, given Russia's continued grip on large parts of your territory, given your heavy dependence on weapons from the West, given your country's not yet materialised? Just how independent is Ukraine? And Prime Minister, you talked about having to endure the cost of living crisis domestically, which some families are experiencing. For many people, that's not an option. As you look to your legacy, do you worry, do you have real concerns that the level of UK military support is just not sustainable, given A, it's out of your control, and B, your successor may well have to turn to more immediate pressing matters for voters? And the second, if I may, you cut a very popular figure here in Ukraine because of that level of support. Have there been moments this year where you've quietly thought, I wish I had that same level of popularity in the UK? Thank you.
Well, you first. The answer to the second question is yes, but
the second question was. So, me first, yes?
You go,
okay, thank you so much. Дякую за запитання. Наскільки ми незалежні?
Now, how independent we are?
Наскільки це можливо сьогодні? Настільки ми незалежні. Я думаю, що наша стійкість за ці 30 років, наша незалежність за ці 30 років сьогодні знаходиться в самому серйозному, самому пікі, самому серці незалежності. Я так вважаю. Ми ніколи не були такі міцні, як нація і як держава. А вже ж, не було війни, десь було простіше з напрямком енергоресурсів, дешевше був газ, не було війни з Росією, якийсь там був транзит, тощо, великі, різні речі, різні абсолютно речі, але країна і навіть геополітично повністю об'єднана не була впевнена в своєму майбутньому. Я вважаю, що сьогодні ми всі згуртовані. Більше 90% вважають себе повністю незалежні. Розуміються, що хочуть бути в Європі. Розуміються, що потрібні гарантії безпеки і бачать себе в альянсі. Розуміють, що хочуть бути незалежними від будь-яких агресій Російської Федерації. Розуміють, що повинна бути потрібна сильна, потужна армія, і ми готові виборювати свою незалежність і готові виборювати її на полі бою. Я вважаю, що все це риси дорослої, незважаючи на 31 рік, дорослої, незалежної, сильної держави, багатонаціональної, різноманітної, але такою, яка демонструє сьогодні таку одностайність. І мені здається, що ми знаходимося сьогодні саме в цій точці. І дуже важливо це не втратити. Те, що я повертаюся іноді до меседжів об'єднання нашої держави. Я впевнений, що такого ніколи не було. Я впевнений в цьому, що
I
це
think
не
this has
можна,
never been
просто
like
не
that
можна
before.
втратити.
I think this is something that we can't
Тому ми
lose.
повністю незалежні, незважаючи
we
на
are
ваші
completely
запитання, що
united
20%
despite,
нашої території
your
поки що
question
тимчасово
that,
окуповані. Але повірте мені,
so
навіть на
percent
тих
of our
територіях,
territory is
в
still
багатьох
occupied.
містечках і
Believe me,
селах,
even in
такі
those
самі
occupied
міцні,
territories,
незалежні люди. Іноді навіть
there is
міцніші,
strong
бо їм
people,
там складно.
over there
Багатьом там
who
складно.
feel independent, and they're even
Багатьом там
stronger
сьогодні
maybe than the rest of
великі
the
ризики в День
Ukrainians,
Незалежності
because it's very
вийти на
difficult
вулиці
for them,
окупованої
and they're facing
Херсонщини з
significant
українськими
risks
прапорами або
going on the
Мелітополя,
streets of
або Криму
Kherson or
тощо.
Melitopol
Я
or
думаю, що вони
Ukrainian.
там дуже міцні
And I think
українці.
there's
Вони нас
very
чекають.
strong Ukrainians in there
А якщо
waiting
чекають, то
for
ми
us to come. And
повернемося.
if they're
Я в цьому
waiting,
впевнений.
then we'll return, and I'm confident about this.
Yeah, so on the effects of the war in Ukraine on people's bills and no one can minimize this, and it's the suffering, the hardship is real for people, and these bills are rocketing, and we've got to do everything we can to help, and that's why we're putting cash in people's pockets as much as we can. More is coming, as you know. Later on this year, there'll be further announcements, as you will have heard. But you've also got to fix the underlying issue, which is the dependence on hydrocarbons that are very volatile and vulnerable to the manipulations of people like Putin. And that's why the government is going through this massive program of investment in nuclear, in wind, in things that make us energy self-reliant. That's the key thing. But on your basic question about, is it sensible to pay for British taxpayers to support freedom in Ukraine, I say it is absolutely vital. And we've got to continue to do it. Because as I said just now, if Putin gets away with it, if he continues to think that he can change borders by force with impunity, then the whole of the periphery of the former Soviet Union, or the periphery of Russia, will be vulnerable to his aggression, and possibly the read across will be felt elsewhere around the world, in the Pacific region as well. And I just remind you of the lesson from history. At the end of the 1930s, basically, people decided that enough was enough, and they stood up to the changing of borders by force in Europe. And it was incredibly painful, and it took a long time. But they asserted that principle, and the post-war order was based on that principle, that you can't change borders by force. And there then followed decade after decade of peace and growth and prosperity. And that's why it's worth fighting for. That's the fundamental economic as well as the political reason why there's so much at stake here in Ukraine today.
Пан прем'єр-міністр згадав ще американську допомогу, тому пропоную надати слово американським ЗМІ, ABC. Так, і це буде останнє запитання.
President Zelensky, a massive military aid package is expected again from the US. What impact do you expect this to have in your fight in this war? And secondly, is Kyiv safe today? How safe is Kyiv? How well protected is it?
Can you sit down, please? Thank you.
Дуже дякую. По-перше, всі безумовно знають, що при всій повазі до кожної держави у світі Сполучені Штати Америки надали Україні найбільшу допомогу. Вони найпотужніші і економічно, і з точки зору політичного впливу, і ми прекрасно з вами розуміємо, що Україні потрібна і фінансова допомога, і допомога Міжнародного валютного фонду тощо. Так? І при цьому ми безумовно розуміємо, що сьогодні на полі бою, коли нам потрібна зброя, і ми розуміємо, що Сполучені Штати Америки, їх пакети можуть нам допомогти і швидше, і більше, і обсяг. Тому, про що говорити, ми вдячні допомогі Сполучених Штатів Америки. Ми вдячні і Конгресу, і двопартійній підтримці. Я вдячний особисто президенту Байдену. Ми знаходимося на великій відстані одне одного, але мені здається, що ми не раз підкреслювали це, і Сполучені Штати це бачать, що ми боремося за одні ті самі цінності. Що стосується безпечності в Києві, а ви зараз боїтесь когось?
Are you afraid of something or somebody?
Are you afraid now? No. Ми не боїмось Російську Федерацію. Небезпеку в нашій державі може створити представники тільки однієї держави. Весь інший цивілізований світ нас підтримує.
Дякую. На цьому завершую. Дякую.
Thank you so much.
Дуже дякую.
Thank you so much.
Good job.
Thanks a lot.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you.
We can go.
We go now. We
Окей. Доброго дня, шановні журналісти, шановні присутні. I will translate, great. But I think that the Prime Minister not the first time in Ukraine. He knows a lot of Ukrainian words.
Дякую.
Дякую.
Але я думаю, пан прем'єр-міністр не перший раз в Україні багато українських слів знає.
Сьогодні в День Незалежності нашої держави, головне свято нашої незалежної, міцної і прекрасної держави. Ми зустрічаємо прем'єр-міністра Великої Британії Бориса Джонсона, великого друга нас всіх.
Today, at this Independence Day, which is a big festivity for a great blossoming nation, we meet the big friend of Ukraine, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Mr. Boris Johnson.
Ми зустрічаємо сьогодні його зі своєю командою і вдячні йому особисто за його лідерство, вдячні за всі ці місяці підтримки, вдячні суспільству Великої Британії, вдячні за велику допомогу, яку щоденно, постійно, упродовж цього повномасштабного вторгнення для нас робила дійсно велика держава Велика Британія.
And me and my team, we're welcoming him here, and we want to thank him for his lead, his constant support, and the constant support of the UK society. This is assistance that comes to Ukraine every day in these very hard times.
Але допомога, вона потрібна завжди, коли потрібно. Вона потрібна вчасно. Тому я хочу подякувати Борису не тільки за те, що він зробив разом зі своїм народом, а за те, коли він це зробив. А саме з самого початку.
But the assistance is an important thing when you need it at the very precise time. That is why I'd like to thank Boris Johnson and his society for that assistance that came very timely.
І всім тим лідерам, які проявили свої лідерські якості, зробили це вчасно, допомогли нам відстояти нашу державу, нашу незалежність, Київщину. Ми будемо дякувати не тільки на словах, а хочемо дякувати історично.
Also we'd like to thank all the leaders that came with their support very timely and helped us to defend our capital, to defend the Kyiv region, and to defend our state and independence. And we want to make this not just by words, but by also writing down the history.
І тому сьогодні на цій алеї сміливості, Walk of the Brave, сьогодні з'явиться ім'я прем'єр-міністра Великої Британії Бориса Джонсона.
That is why at this Walk of the Brave we'll have the name of the Prime Minister of United Kingdom, Boris Johnson.
Дякую Великобританії, дякую тобі, Борисе. Слава Україні!
Thanks to the UK, thanks to you, Boris, and glory to Ukraine.
Well, Volodymyr, thank you very much, and thank you for this latest incredible honor that you've done me after you gave me that beautiful medal insignia just now, and that comes on top of my election as an honorary Cossack. And the card that I got from Ukrainian Railways, which gives me, I think, free travel. I don't know whether it gives me free travel. They said it gave me free travel on Ukrainian. It's a kind of freedom pass for Ukrainian Railways. So, but I want to stress that in receiving these, this is very much something I accept on behalf of the people of the whole of the United Kingdom, because it's really been a cause that has captured the imagination of all of our country. And I see the Ukrainian flag flying here. You will see it also in the streets of London, in villages, in towns across the whole of the UK, on churches, in shop windows. You will see the support that the British people have for the people of Ukraine. And my essential message for you today is that that support for your struggle to keep your independence is indivisible and will remain whatever happens in UK politics. And of that, I am absolutely certain. Thank you very much for the welcome you've given me, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Дякую, Борис.
Thank you.
Сам фото.
Face to us.
Sorry.
We can be like this.
Unbelievable. So you put your mobile phone on that?
Yes.
And what happened?
Дякую.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. That's Andrew Duda.
Yes.
Who else is here?
Don't step on Duda.
No.
No. Only the name of Ali. We have only the name of Ali and two surnames, President Duda and Prime Minister Johnson. Here, welcome.
Thank you very
We
much.
began this tradition from you, so a great
I'm
honor.
very honored. I'm very honored. Thank you, everybody. Dякую. Thank you.
Дякуємо.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Що, ми пройдемо?
Yeah. Where are we going? Where are we going?
It's here. We can go there.
Let's go this way.
Yes, we'll go. When Boris coming, we have to go.
Yeah. Come on. Let's go here. Won't go far.
to debate in the 21st century over the aspects that should have long remained in the past. But nevertheless, I thank Mr. Secretary General of the UN and the Turkey and to the President of the Turkey and to all other responsible members of international relations who are fighting against the food crisis to which only Russia is responsible. In the coming weeks, we have to do everything to expand the existing grain initiative. Let's take another aspect, the energy. It is a fact that Russia is deliberately trying to impose energy poverty upon tens of millions of people, deprive them of normal access to basic goods by deliberately raising energy prices. All this is done by a permanent member to the UN Security Council who still uses the privilege of its veto right. The energy crisis for Europe, the threat of large-scale hunger, the political chaos for African and Asian countries, the price crisis in the whole world, isn't it too much for a single country whose representative sits among you? I will mention one more aspect, the values. Indeed, we should honestly talk about the point that values are perceived differently in different parts of the world. There's different approaches, but everywhere in the world, life has value, peace has value, economic prosperity has value. All countries, if they respect themselves and their people, punish for murder and not honor the executioners. However, we see that there is a country that is not behaves differently and is proud of doing so. It rewards murderers and encourages executioners. And this is a threat not only for Ukraine. Thousands of Ukrainians were killed by the Russian invaders. Dozens of our cities were destroyed by Russian artillery. Russia does not comply with fundamental conventions on the prisoners of war. This is something that was also mentioned today. The deliberate killing by the Russian occupiers of our prisoners of war in Olenivka became one of the most terrible pages in the history of Europe. And there is an immediate need for a UN fact-finding mission in Olenivka, and the mandate of which should be extended to cover all Ukrainian POWs currently held by Russian forces. There is no such war crime that the Russian occupiers have not yet committed on the territory of Ukraine. But if Russia is not stopped now, and in Ukraine, if it is not stopped by the victory of Ukraine, then all these Russian murderers will inevitably end up in other countries, Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America. There are traces of Russian war criminals everywhere, and we must all get united and act decisively as soon as possible, so there are no more traces of Russian missiles and no more cities burned by Russian artillery, so that there would be no threat of a radiation catastrophe ever again. Russia must release the captured territory of Ukraine so that there would be no food crisis. Russia would need to withdraw from our land, from our sea, so that no country in the world can ever again disregard the UN and conventions binding on all mankind. There's no Russia must be held accountable for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. The relevant resolution will be submitted for the consideration of the 77th session of the UN General Assembly. In order for a sense of justice to return to international relations, we must all confirm and force Russia to recognize that the inviolability of borders and peace are unconditional values for all nations. This is why the independence and integrity of our country are of fundamental importance for the international relations. Preserving our independence, guaranteeing returning normal economic ties with Ukraine will restore the true power to the UN Charter and save the world from the crises that we're all forced to face now. Mr. General Secretary Antonio Guterres, has the ambitious intention of organizing the summit of the future next year. We support this initiative and reaffirm that in order to build the future, it's necessary to leave in the dustbin of history what has always prevented humanity from living in peace, namely the aggression and colonial ambitions. That is what Russia has came with to Ukraine. And I believe that we can surely build the future. That would be good and symbolic to have this summit in Ukraine. It is on the territory of Ukraine that the world's future is decided, whether we will have a future at all. This is being decided also at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and in our seaports and in Donbas and in the Crimea. Our independence is your security, the security of the entire. For this opportunity, for the understanding of my situation, for the situation of our country. Thank you for the attention, and I thank the Chinese presidency to participate in this session in the online format. Glory to Ukraine.
我感谢泽连斯基先生阁下的发言。下面请安理会成员发言。我请美国代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Secretary General Guterres and Undersecretary General DiCarlo for your briefings. I would also like to congratulate Ukrainians on their Independence Day and thank President Zelensky for participating in this meeting today. President Zelensky, the United States stands with you and the people of Ukraine today and every day. And every Russian bomb that falls only strengthens our resolve to support your sovereignty and your independence. Today marks 6 months of Russia's premeditated, unjustifiable, and brutal full-scale war against Ukraine. Just 6 months since we, sitting here in the council chamber, watched as Russia, serving in the presidency, attempted to defend the indefensible. 6 months of Russia's defiance of the international community. 6 months of Russia's flagrant lies and disregard for international law, including violations of the UN Charter. 6 months of attacks by Russia, killing Ukrainian civilians and destroying civilian infrastructure. 6 months of devastation and missile strikes that have torn apart families and stolen the lives of too many, like the life of 4-year-old Lisa Dmitrieva, killed last month in a missile strike that left 24 people dead. 6 months of horrific atrocities, including rape, murder, and torture in towns like Bucha and Irpin and others. 6 months of families being separated and millions displaced. 6 months of killings, thousands dead. 6 months later, Russia's goal is as clear as ever: to dismantle Ukraine as a geopolitical entity and erase it from the world map. Russian disinformation campaigns are increasingly being weaponized to prepare for further attempts to annex Ukrainian territory. Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov publicly acknowledged this as one of the Kremlin's objectives. Specifically, Russia is laying groundwork to attempt to annex the regions of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia and all of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. Let's be clear. The international community will never recognize Russia's attempt to change Ukraine's borders by force. And when the world's leaders come to New York next month to reaffirm their commitments to the UN Charter, they are also reaffirming their support for that basic principle. So no matter how many more sham referendums, illegitimate authorities Moscow tries to install, we will continue to defend the UN Charter and uphold Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. And as we discussed yesterday, Russia is responsible for creating another grave risk to another core commitment by the international community to nuclear safety. Ukraine had an impeccable record of nuclear energy safety and security at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. But Russia recklessly attacked and seized control of this plant by force, risking nuclear disaster. In a similar vein, we are particularly concerned by Russia's so-called filtration operations, which involve the systematic forced deportations of Ukrainian civilians to remote areas of Russia. These camps are abducting and separating children from their parents. Russian forces are forcibly confiscating and replacing passports, dictating curriculums in schools, and replacing Ukrainian street names and other public signs with Russian language alternatives. The evidence of Russian forces interrogating, detaining, and forcibly deporting hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, including children, continue to mount. The reasons are clear. They want to destroy Ukraine, its culture, its people, its very existence. Even where we have seen progress, like the movement of grain and other foodstuff from Ukrainian ports following the much-needed arrangements signed with Turkey, Russia did not let us forget about its intentions. Mere hours after the deal was inked, Russia launched missiles at the port of Odessa. Those missiles were a potent reminder. Millions of Ukrainians are still under siege, and tens of millions around the world are being driven to hunger by Russia's actions. For all this violence and carnage, these hunger and humanitarian crises, these human rights abuses and threats to vulnerable groups, Russia, and Russia alone, bears sole responsibility. And Russia alone is the sole hindrance to a swift resolution to this crisis. We must continue to call for and ensure accountability for all of Russia's atrocities. Today marks 6 months of the war, but it also marks Ukraine's Independence Day, a day normally celebrated by parades, with festivals, with joy. Many of us came together in a similar kind of celebration on July 4th last month on the UN lawn as America celebrated its independence. And we ate and we danced and we looked in awe at the fireworks in the sky. In Ukraine today, there are none of the typical festivals, no feasts or concerts. Citizens have been told to stay away from cities and to look for very different kinds of explosions from the sky. And we heard President Zelensky describe just that to us today. One Ukrainian citizen told an NPR reporter that she hopes that, and I'll quote her, she hopes that we can celebrate independence without weapons in the future, maybe with flowers and dances instead. Let us do everything we can to bring the flowers and the dances back to Kyiv, back to Ukrainians. And let us pray by this time next year, her dream has come true. Thank you, Mr. President.
谢谢美国代表的发言，下面请阿尔巴尼亚代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me also thank the ESG and USG DiCarlo for their update information. 31 years ago today, Ukraine declared its independence from the decaying Soviet Union. It is a day to celebrate, and I'm sure, despite the situation, Ukrainians in Ukraine and abroad will proudly mark their day in a way or another. We join them in this and welcome you, President Zelensky, in this meeting under the exceptional circumstances you and your country continue to endure. But celebrations are not easy and hardly joyful when you are under attack by your neighbor that pretends from dawn to dusk to be your brother. But that kind of brother that is assaulting you, killing your people, destroying your homes, bombarding your cities, abusing your women, deporting your people, breaking your country, denying your existence. That abusive brother that wants to take everything you have. Mr. President, today marks also exactly 6 months from the start of the invasion, the day when the UN Charter was thrown in the Kremlin shredder, when the term respect for international law lost any meaning in Moscow. It marks 27 weeks from the adoption of the United Nations General Assembly resolution, when the whole world but 4 asked Russia to stop the war and respect the sovereignty of Ukraine. It marks 25 weeks from a legally binding order of the International Court of Justice, the highest international court addressed to Russia to immediately stop military activities. All these calls and documents continue to be ignored. Russia persists in its course with a clear intention to dismantle Ukraine and subjugate its people, despite unquestionable evidence and hard proof that its actions have and continue to produce serious global destabilizing effects on security, energy, food, including the risk of a nuclear catastrophe, and are increasingly decoupling Russia from the rest of the European continent. We commend Turkey and the Secretary General for their tireless and successful efforts in making sure that grain and other food products are exported from Ukraine and go on the tables of the needy throughout the world. Colleagues, the war is having a terrible negative impact on everything in Ukraine and beyond, but hardly anything compares with the devastating impact on civilians in general and their children in particular, the future generation. Some 1,000 children, maybe more, will not be there to see the liberated Ukraine. They have been killed, 5 every day. 5.2 million are in need of humanitarian assistance. 3.6 million have been affected by the closure of schools or by the impact of attack on schools, which will continue to delay children's return to in-person learning. Many more millions are left with invisible wounds that must be addressed without delay to prioritize children's mental health and psychological needs and help them build resilience. If there were one single reason to put an immediate end to this war, it is this: to save children, the future generations from the scourge of war, as it is written in our Constitution. Mr. President, a few weeks ago, a deadly explosion killed 53 Ukrainian prisoners of war held in Ukraine territory under the Russian control. This tragic event is still not independently elucidated, and as for everything of that nature, we are told that Ukraine did it. Prisoners of war should have been protected by law, as well as by the guarantees given to the UN and the International Committee for Red Cross, that the Azov detainees would be properly treated. Unfortunately, 53 of them were killed. We welcome the appointment of the investigation team by the Secretary General. We strongly ask the UN to do everything to make sure that the investigation is done impartially and on the UN terms. Those responsible for such despicable crimes must be held accountable. Mr. President, with the regular army stretched thin after 6 months of a disastrous and bloody invasion of Ukraine, there is increasing evidence that the Kremlin is making dreadful choices and recruiting Russia's prisoners to fight. Credible reports and meticulous investigations point into that direction. This is very worrying in a situation that is already alarming, since when we have seen what regular soldiers were able to execute in Bucha, we have shivers thinking about what may happen when you give weapons to murderers and criminals who should be behind bars in Russia and not in Ukraine in military uniform. These new fighters, if that proves true, will fill in for those who have come to senses, discovered the truth and abandoned the war, not to continue to be partners in crime, like Pavel Filatiev. He was sent to Kherson. He is free to speak his mind now and tell his story. And what is he saying? Let me quote. We understood that we were dragged into a serious conflict where we are simply destroying towns and not actually liberating anyone. We do not see any reason that our government is trying to explain to us. All of it is a lie. We are just destroying peaceful lives, end of quote. His account is much longer, 141 pages, out there in the open for everyone to read the immense despair of someone sent to commit crimes next door. Mr. President, we have warned before and wish to reiterate, particularly on this day, any territory annexation, any development incompatible with the Ukrainian constitution imposed by Russia, such as sham elections or referendums à la Russe, will not be accepted, will not be recognized. Russian officials in the territories under Russian control speak openly of joining Russia by implementing the Crimea template. This will be null and void, a dead end. As stated by key European leaders as recently as yesterday, Ukraine friends are ready to support Ukraine's fight to defend itself, not because anyone is against Russia and the Russians, but simply because all those who are for peace see in Ukraine the litmus test of the European security architecture and the stress test of resilience of world peace and security in front of long-gone imperial behavior. Colleagues, on this day we reaffirm once more our full and unwavering solidarity with the people of Ukraine. We pay tribute to all those who are fighting to defend their land and their lives, and to all those sacrificed for the independence and freedom of Ukraine. We reiterate our support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and we call on Russia to stop the war, withdraw its troops, and change course, so that next year at this time there is a real happy parade in Kyiv, not the one with the burnt out or abandoned husks of Russian military equipment, the epitome of this senseless war. And I thank you.
感谢阿尔巴尼亚代表的发言，下面请法国代表发言。
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie le secrétaire général et Madame Di Carlo pour leur présentation et je souhaiterais saluer l'intervention du président Zelensky ce matin. Monsieur le Président, depuis 6 mois précisément, les Ukrainiens résistent avec un courage extraordinaire à la guerre d'agression lancée par la Russie, avec son lot terrible de souffrances et d'exactions de masse. Les Ukrainiens, faut-il le rappeler, se battent pour la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de leur pays. Quel meilleur moment pour leur rendre hommage qu'aujourd'hui, jour de leur fête nationale qui a marqué en 1991 l'indépendance de l'Ukraine. À travers sa lutte, l'Ukraine défend aussi les buts et les principes de la Charte des Nations Unies. Et c'est pourquoi la France continuera de se tenir à ses côtés. Avec nos partenaires européens, nous continuerons à la soutenir aussi longtemps qu'il le faudra face à l'agression russe. En ce jour de célébration de l'indépendance ukrainienne, je redis aussi clairement que la France ne reconnaîtra jamais l'annexion des territoires occupés par la Fédération de Russie. La France ne reconnaîtra pas la légitimité de référendums d'indépendance qui seraient organisés par la Russie dans ces territoires pour tenter de légitimer son agression, pour maquiller ces violations flagrantes du droit international, pas plus qu'elle n'a reconnu ou qu'elle ne reconnaîtra l'annexion de la Crimée. Monsieur le Président, avec cette guerre, la Russie contribue à déstabiliser encore davantage un monde sur lequel pèsent déjà de graves menaces. Nous nous félicitons que le centre de coordination conjoint à Istanbul soit désormais opérationnel, que 33 navires aient pu quitter les ports ukrainiens depuis la signature des accords d'Istanbul. Mais ne nous leurrons pas, les effets négatifs de la guerre conduite par la Russie se poursuivent, perdurent et se multiplient. Les chaînes d'approvisionnement sont toujours perturbées, les coûts de transport demeurent très élevés, le marché de l'énergie est bouleversé, et tant que durera l'agression russe, ces effets continueront à se propager. La présence de troupes russes sur le site de la centrale nucléaire de Zaporizhzhia fait également peser le risque d'un accident nucléaire aux effets potentiellement dévastateurs. Nous rappelons notre appel au retrait des forces russes. Tout incident serait de la responsabilité première de la Russie. Il est crucial que l'AIEA puisse conduire une mission d'experts sur le terrain dans les plus brefs délais. Monsieur le Président, les informations qui nous parviennent concernant des exécutions extrajudiciaires, des actes de torture à l'encontre des prisonniers ukrainiens, en particulier dans le village de Lenivka, mais pas seulement, sont extrêmement choquants. La Russie doit respecter le droit international humanitaire. Il s'applique à tous les conflits armés internationaux, nous le rappelons, qu'elles reconnaissent ou non être en guerre, ainsi que le droit international des droits de l'homme. La France, aux côtés de ses partenaires, s'est mobilisée dès les premiers jours de l'agression russe pour que les auteurs des crimes commis en Ukraine soient identifiés, soient poursuivis et que leurs crimes soient documentés. Nous soutenons activement le travail de la Cour pénale internationale qui enquête sur des faits susceptibles de constituer des crimes de guerre, de génocide ou de crimes contre l'humanité. Nous soutenons également les enquêtes des juridictions ukrainiennes. Et nous resterons aussi attentifs aux éléments que publiera prochainement la commission d'enquête internationale et indépendante qui a été créée par le Conseil des droits de l'homme avec le soutien de la France. Enfin, nous appelons une nouvelle fois la Russie à faire le choix de la diplomatie pour rebâtir la paix avec l'Ukraine dans le respect de sa souveraineté, dans le respect de son intégrité territoriale et dans ses frontières internationalement reconnues. Ce au moment et dans les conditions que décideront les Ukrainiens qui sont la partie agressée. La France continuera à s'engager à cette fin. Je vous remercie.
我感谢法国代表的发言，下面请爱尔兰代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would like to thank the Secretary-General for his remarks and indeed his efforts with regards to resolving the war in Ukraine and its wider consequences, including for global food security. I also thank USG Di Carlo for her briefing, and I want to welcome President Zelensky's address to the Council and reiterate Ireland's unwavering friendship and support to the people of Ukraine on the occasion of their Independence Day. Mr. President, it is 8.5 years since Russia first violated the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. It is 6 months to the day since Russia launched its further illegal, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, violating and attacking the core principles of this United Nations. Yet let us be clear, the internationally recognised borders of Ukraine have not changed in the last 6 months, nor in the last 8.5 years. The decision by Russia to invade Ukraine has not changed those borders. They did not change in 2014, and they have not changed in 2022. Neither will unilateral steps by Russia to integrate parts of Ukraine be recognised for anything other than flagrant violations of the principles of sovereign independence and non-intervention, and a bold attempt to entrench a supposed sphere of influence. We also condemn the dangerous, escalatory and unacceptable nuclear rhetoric by Russia during this conflict. Mr. President, for 183 days, Ireland has called for an end to the unjustified and unjustifiable war being waged against Ukraine. As each day passes, reports of violations of human rights and international humanitarian law by Russia grow. Civilians in Ukraine continue to pay the highest price. For 6 months, they have been living under terror, not knowing when and where the next bomb will strike. We therefore once again call on Russia to comply with its obligations under international law. Parties to the conflict must comply with international humanitarian law. They have an obligation to distinguish between civilians and combatants and not to attack civilian objects. There is a prohibition against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, and an obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack. And compliance is not optional. Mr. President, as I said yesterday at our meeting, Ireland remains extremely concerned by the situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and the serious risk of a radiological accident or incident arising from military activity at the site with devastating consequences. We call on Russia to end its illegal occupation of the site, withdraw its troops and munitions, and ensure that the Ukrainian authorities can uphold their responsibilities for safety and security at the site. We welcome reports that a visit by the IAEA could go ahead soon and support the Secretary-General's call for the plant to remain connected to the Ukrainian power grid. Mr. President, once again, we call on Russia to end its brutal war and withdraw its troops from the entire internationally recognized territory of Ukraine, and to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its neighbours. Russia can end its aggression if it chooses, but even while it chooses to execute its illegal war, it still has obligations under international law, and it must comply with those obligations. We note this morning the comments from the Secretary-General and the UN Secretary and the Under-Secretary-General on humanitarian need, particularly in the face of the onset of winter. Russia's aggression continues to cause mounting hardship and suffering for the people of Ukraine, who have shown remarkable resilience and resolve. Today, Ireland stands in full solidarity with them. Thank you.
我感谢爱尔兰代表的发言。下面请挪威代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Russia's war in Ukraine is affecting us all. It is an attack on democratic values and on freedom. It's causing a global food crisis, and it's a blatant violation of international law and the very principles of the UN Charter. To President Zelensky, thank you for your strong testimony this morning and for the heroic fight you and the Ukrainian people are engaged in for your country and for peace and freedom of us all. Today we mark the Ukrainian Declaration of Independence in 1991. And here we are, 31 years later, because the Soviet successor state Russia has invaded Ukraine. It's truly tragic. So we reiterate our unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. USG DiCarlo, thank you for your thorough and thoughtful briefing. And Secretary General, thank you for your briefing, including on your important recent visit to Ukraine. Norway applauds your crucial role in the Black Sea Grain Initiative and your further tireless efforts to alleviate the consequences of this horrible war and to restore peace. President, Norway condemns the Russian military aggression in the strongest terms possible. Russia's warfare in urban and populated areas and the use of heavy explosive weapons is destroying homes, schools, and hospitals. And the ongoing attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, including nuclear power plants, is having a devastating and unacceptable impact. Thousands of civilians have already been killed. Millions have fled their homes. Others are trapped in war zones. We stand with the people all over Ukraine who continue to live in daily fear of the next attack. And we reiterate our demand that civilians must be protected and international humanitarian law and international human rights law fully respected and implemented. Humanitarian actors must be ensured access. Russia must stop the war and fully, immediately, and unconditionally withdraw its forces and military equipment from Ukraine. Russia started the war in Ukraine. It can choose to stop it. It seems clear that war crimes are being committed. These cannot be forgotten. Perpetrators on all levels must be held accountable. President, the Secretary General has talked about the beacon of hope with the resumption of Ukrainian grain exports. We are encouraged that the critical transportation line from a global breadbasket might be restored. It is much needed for Ukrainians as well as the world's most vulnerable people and countries. And it is critical that the World Food Programme and other humanitarian actors again can purchase grain from Ukraine for humanitarian food assistance. It is now vital that the Black Sea Grain Initiative is fully implemented. President, the accumulated effects on the war are felt by more people every day. In May, this Council expressed its unified support for the efforts of the Secretary General in the search for a peaceful solution. We must continue to support the Secretary General in his efforts for dialogue and mediation between the parties in the search for peace and freedom for the people of Ukraine. and we stress the joint responsibility of the members of this Council to make every effort to ensure peace. Again, to the Ukrainian people, our thoughts are with you on your National Day and every other day. We reiterate our solidarity with you. I thank you.
我感谢挪威代表的发言，下面请英国代表发言。
Thank you, President. On behalf of the United Kingdom, I thank the Secretary-General and Under-Secretary-General De Carlo for their briefings. We warmly welcome President Zelensky's participation in today's meeting. 6 months ago, even as this Council met late into the night to try to avert catastrophe, Russia launched an unprovoked and illegal invasion of Ukraine in violation of the UN Charter. In the months that followed, Ukraine has been subjected to the full horrors of war. As we've heard today, thousands of civilians have been killed or wounded. Over 17 million are now in need of humanitarian assistance. Schools, hospitals, and other medical facilities have been attacked. We have seen a pattern of Russian violations of international humanitarian law and of Russian human rights abuses and violations, including reports of torture, inhumane treatment, and arbitrary detention. Ukrainian citizens, including children, have been forcibly deported to Russia. 6 million people are displaced within Ukraine, and over 6 million are refugees abroad. And the people of Ukraine are not the only victims of this war. Beyond Ukraine's borders, Putin's decisions have had a devastating impact on the world's most vulnerable, with many millions across the world affected by rising food and fuel prices. We again pay tribute to the work of the UN Secretary-General with Turkey to negotiate the Black Sea Grain Initiative. President, today, in what would be another violation of the UN Charter, there are reports that Russia is planning fake referenda to illegally annex more territory from Ukraine. Any such attempt would fool no one. Russia has, after all, lied throughout their illegal invasion, using disinformation to create false pretexts, undermine Ukrainian sovereignty, obscure the truth, and hide war crimes. And it would further demonstrate Russia's contempt for the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, principles which, as member states of this organization, we have all committed to upholding. President, 31 years ago today, Ukraine declared its independence, with over 90% of Ukrainians voting in favor. Today, that pride in Ukrainian identity and sovereignty remains as strong as ever. We have all seen the courage and ingenuity of the Ukrainian people as they have fought to defend their nation against Russia's attack on their national sovereignty and right to self-determination. Ukraine's fight is a fight for the principles of the UN Charter. All of us in this chamber have a responsibility to recognize that. It is a fight that has inspired the world with its courage and defiance against brutality. So today, on Ukrainian Independence Day, we stand together with the nation of Ukraine and its heroic people who continue to resist Russia's attempts to rewrite international borders by force. We once again call for Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine immediately, and we call for full accountability for Russia's crimes. Thank you.
我感谢英国代表的发言，下面请巴西代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I acknowledge the participation in the session of His Excellency President Zelensky, to whom I extend congratulations on the occasion of Ukraine's National Day. I thank the Secretary General and USG Rosemary DiCarlo for their remarks. 6 months after the opening of hostilities, there seems to be no solution in sight for the conflict in Ukraine. The situation is now compounded by the risk of nuclear disaster. It is essential that the parties refrain from attacks that could threaten the safety of nuclear facilities, as has been happening in the vicinity of the Zaporizhzhia plant. Brazil reiterates the call for the two sides to facilitate the access of an IAEA mission so that the conditions of the plant can be properly evaluated. It is deeply saddening to note how little progress has been made towards a political solution. The most notable result was the initiative on grain exports from Ukrainian ports and on facilitating Russian grain and fertilizer exports, announced in July, for which we are grateful to the efforts of the Secretary General and the support of the government of Turkey. When the parties engaged in negotiations, an important result was achieved, which partly alleviates the effects of the conflict on food prices around the world, and particularly in developing countries. Mr. President, reality and history show that closing the door to dialogue is not the right approach to resolving any conflict, and this applies to Ukraine. Actions that prolong the hostilities will only result in greater human suffering and will not resolve the underlying causes. Brazil welcomes the Secretary General's efforts to ensure the implementation of the Istanbul agreements and takes note of his visit to the region last week. It is essential that the international community seek to preserve this important achievement, which indicates a possible path towards broader negotiations. We urge the parties to keep open the channels of dialogue that made possible the Istanbul package, as they offer the best prospects for peace. Finally, we recall the obligation of both sides under international humanitarian law to protect the civilian population and prevent human rights abuses. Attacks against residential areas and facilities such as schools, churches, and hospitals are unacceptable and fuel a logic of retaliation that must be avoided by all means. It is in everyone's interest that the two countries can live peacefully, side by side in the future, and cooperate to achieve their development goals. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢巴西代表的发言，下面请加蓬代表发言。
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie le secrétaire général Antonio Guterres et la secrétaire générale adjointe Rosemary DiCarlo pour leurs exposés respectifs. Je salue la participation à cette réunion du président de la République d'Ukraine. Monsieur le Président, alors que la guerre en Ukraine entre dans son 7e mois, notre mémoire est pleine de compassion pour toutes les victimes depuis le début du conflit. Nous exprimons notre solidarité aux survivants, parmi lesquels de nombreuses femmes, des enfants, des personnes âgées, des personnes déplacées, des réfugiés dont le quotidien a été bouleversé. Nous rendons hommage au personnel humanitaire qui, sur le terrain, s'emploie à édulcorer l'atrocité du quotidien des survivants de la guerre en apportant une aide vitale et précieuse, souvent dans des conditions extrêmement difficiles. Au bilan de la guerre s'ajoute un bilan matériel très lourd. Les images de destruction d'édifices publics, des voies de communication, d'infrastructures de distribution de services publics sont devenues quotidiennes. Les bombardements visant des installations nucléaires, dont la centrale nucléaire de Zaporizhzhia est le symbole, font agiter le risque de catastrophe nucléaire. Un risque qui s'accroît au fil du développement de l'activité militaire autour de ce site. Il est urgent que l'activité militaire cesse autour des sites nucléaires et que les belligérants s'abstiennent de toute action susceptible de faire courir au monde le risque d'une catastrophe nucléaire dont les conséquences seraient irréparables. Nous réitérons notre appel aux parties à se conformer aux règles de sécurité nucléaire en vigueur et à coopérer avec l'AIEA pour sécuriser les sites potentiellement dangereux en vue de prévenir les risques de catastrophe. Nous saluons les récentes annonces indiquant la volonté des parties de mettre une mission des experts de l'AIEA à la centrale de Zaporizhia pour éviter tout embrasement. Nous réitérons notre opposition à la guerre et notre indignation face aux attaques visant des civils. Nous ne nous lasserons pas de répéter que les parties au conflit doivent respecter les engagements internationaux souscrits en vertu du droit international humanitaire. Monsieur le Président, la dernière mise à jour du Bureau du Haut-Commissaire des droits de l'homme fait état d'un bilan de 13 477 victimes civiles, dont 5 587 tués et 7 890 blessés. Un grand nombre de civils, dont des enfants, sont mutilés par des armes explosives de large portée aux effets indiscriminés. Aussi longtemps que les combats se poursuivront, la situation humanitaire en Ukraine et dans les pays environnants ne cessera certainement pas de se détériorer. L'on ne peut prédire à ce jour l'étendue des répercussions physiques et psychologiques qui en découleront, encore moins les conséquences économiques dont l'onde de choc ne cesse de s'étendre. Monsieur le Président, depuis 7 mois, ce Conseil est en proie à une fragmentation sans précédent et vit au rythme des invectives d'un camp contre l'autre, pendant que villes, villages sont ravagés, femmes, hommes et enfants sont meurtris par une guerre sanglante. Notre mandat est d'arrêter les guerres à défaut de les prévenir. Il est urgent que nous puissions nous réconcilier avec notre mandat et avec la vocation de ce Conseil. Face à la logique sans issue de l'affrontement et de l'antagonisme, mon pays continuera de choisir le camp de la paix, le camp de la négociation et le camp du dialogue. Nous devons activer les voies du dialogue. C'est la position constante de mon pays qui, depuis le début des hostilités, s'est positionné en faveur de la concertation comme mode privilégié de règlement des conflits. Le récent accord conclu pour permettre l'exportation de céréales des ports ukrainiens est un espoir qui en appelle d'autres. Il est grand temps que la paix revienne au centre de nos priorités. Pour terminer, mon pays appelle une fois de plus les parties à s'engager fermement dans les négociations de bonne foi, dans l'objectif de faire taire les armes et ramener la paix en Ukraine. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
我感谢加蓬代表的发言，下面请肯尼亚代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres and Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for their updates on the situation in Ukraine. Kenya takes this opportunity to convey our best wishes to President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine on their Independence Day. We regret that what should be a day of celebration is impaired by a war that has breached Ukraine's territorial integrity, contrary to the fundamental principles of the UN Charter. The people of Ukraine have suffered greatly these past 6 months. We offer them, and particularly the bereaved families, our deepest condolences. Mr. President, Ukraine's Independence Day gives us an opportunity to appreciate our own independence, as I am sure is the case for every member of this assembly. We will forever be thankful for the brave men and women who fought for our freedom. We joined the UN within days of becoming independent. We signed up to its principles because as a young nation, we needed assurance that our sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence would be respected. We valued its mission to outlaw aggression, to use its instruments to help us turn our swords into plowshares so that we could enjoy the fruits of our freedom. We remain thankful that this United Nations stood for decolonization, that it gave voice to the smallest countries in the world without regard to their military might or wealth. What a precious heritage we have, and how intolerable that it should be as endangered as it is today. We are forced by this moment to recall how its failed predecessor, the League of Nations, was unable to stop the conflicts that led to the Great Fire of World War II. Multilateralism, as expressed in the United Nations, including in this venerated chamber, with all its flaws, is our last hope against a new world war. The wars we choose to fight as Kenya and Africa, as I believe is the case for most of the world, are for independence from poverty, ignorance, and disease. We have no desire to be drawn into a worldwide conflict, or for our grievances and disagreements to be the soil in which wars by proxy take root. We see in Ukraine's war a grim warning that we too may be engulfed by the competitions and confrontations that are contributing to its ferocity. That is why we believe that Ukraine's immediate fate is so important to all of us. Ukraine deserves the same freedom and independence that we enjoy. It is a member of our UN in good standing. Its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence should be respected. Its people do not deserve to have their lives and livelihoods destroyed. Unless the Ukraine war is stopped through dialogue and negotiation, it could be the first of a series of conflicts that future historians will name the Third World War. Such a disaster would be different from the last wars and all the wars before them. The dangers of direct conflict between nuclear-armed powers means that most of their confrontations would be undertaken by proxy. Africa and the rest of the world would be thrown into a mirror of the Cold War that shattered our democracies, overthrew and killed our leaders, and robbed us of decades of economic progress. Stopping this war in a manner that adheres to the principles of the UN Charter is what will keep other old grievances from boiling over. Mr. President, not all is lost. Even in such dark times, we must remember that in the past, serious threats to international peace and security have been successfully resolved. There is yet a chance to build on the slim but important success represented by the agreement between the parties for the secure export of Ukraine's food products through the Black Sea, as well as food and fertilizer exports from Russia. We commend the Secretary General and the government of Turkey for their crucial facilitation. The willingness of the parties to negotiate and the alertness, subtle skill, and moral persuasion of the facilitators demonstrate that diplomacy is still able to deliver if given a chance. We cannot leave our fate to the most powerful. Some of them may be bent on domination, but we cannot allow it to be at the expense of our common peace. They may project certainty and great power, but none can know or control the future. It is time for intuitive, bold leadership from any and every country that has influence or leverage to push them to dialogue rather than confrontation. The immediate aim should be for cessation of hostilities in Ukraine, the opening of safe humanitarian corridors and unhindered humanitarian access, and the security of all nuclear installations, especially the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. These should be part of a roadmap to achieving a comprehensive agreement that secures the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Such an end, given the emerging escalation between the great powers, would ideally be linked to a broader negotiation that produces a stable European security order. The principles underlying such an order should adhere to the UN Charter and be utilized to stabilize other parts of the world. In the meantime, Kenya, while in the Security Council and in all relevant forums, will offer every support to positive efforts seeking these aims. We will continue to champion the cause of the Secretary General and his team, who need to be commended for their tireless efforts. In this regard, we applaud his recent visit to Lviv. We also pay tribute to the determined efforts by the UN's agencies, funds, and programs to provide humanitarian aid and comfort to Ukraine's most vulnerable. Their impact is evidence of a depth of competence that we hope is resourced and deployed with equal ambition in other conflict areas. Mr. President, we know that even with a gravely threatened multilateralism, as reflected in this downcast Security Council, a spirit of urgency and imagination can still allow us to forge a just peace for Ukraine. I wish for all Ukrainians their continued independence, as I reaffirm Kenya's respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. I thank you for your attention.
感谢肯尼亚代表的发言，现在请阿联酋代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. And at the outset, I would like to thank the Secretary General for his opening remarks and Under Secretary General De Carlo for her valuable briefing. I want to also express our gratitude to the Secretary General and his team for effective use of his good offices. As the Secretary General said, in Odessa, the ships that left Ukrainian ports over the last month carrying grain are indeed vessels of hope. I also thank President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine for his briefing, and I'd like to join my colleagues in congratulating President Zelensky and all Ukrainians for their country's Independence Day. Today, we mark 6 months since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and it is difficult to overstate the toll it has had: the dead, the injured, for those remaining in the country, and those forced to flee. A staggering 1/3 of Ukrainians have been displaced from their homes, and 6.6 million have sought refuge across Europe. Beyond Ukraine's borders, the conflict has exacerbated food insecurity and the rise in commodity prices, both of which add to the daily hardship suffered by hundreds of millions of people around the world. The UAE strongly applauds the agreements brokered with the support of the Secretary General and the Republic of Turkey to facilitate the export of grain, food supplies, and fertilizers to global markets. This rare example of tangible progress cannot, however, be the last. It must incentivize more concerted efforts to mitigate the impact of this conflict on the lives of those most in need, and hopefully ensure that we are not here 6 months from now, marking a year of conflict and further global disruption. Mr. President, the UN Charter provides a repertoire of tools to address the peaceful settlement of disputes, none of which are applicable in the absence of the political will to use them. In turn, this requires us, all of us, to recognize that the war will only end through a negotiated settlement, and that all wars must eventually end, as they have done countless times in human history. There is value in the Council's meetings on Ukraine when they're complemented with action, laser-focused on alleviating the suffering of civilians and finding a political path to this war's end. We cannot change the past, but what happens next is a responsibility we all share. In the last few weeks, we have seen signs of progress, particularly the agreements on agricultural exports. We've also taken positive note of the parties' expressed support for the IAEA to send a mission to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and we urgently reiterate that this must happen. As the Secretary General has said, the warning lights are flashing, and failure to act could be grave. These initiatives all have the potential as confidence-building measures that could unlock broader political discussions, and we need to work hard to preserve and expand these windows towards viable diplomatic initiatives aimed at de-escalation and resolution. Mr. President, a peaceful, sustainable resolution relies ultimately on the UN Charter and international law as our guiding principle. 6 months in, our call for a cessation of hostilities throughout Ukraine is as relevant as it has ever been. We cannot become inured to this war. The stakes are too high, every life is too precious. The conflict should end now, and we need to see leaders from both sides commit to charting that difficult path forward with all of our support. Thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢阿联酋代表的发言，下面请加纳代表发言。
I thank you, Mr. President. I welcome the participation in this meeting of President Zelensky and other Rule 39 participants. We wish Ukraine best wishes on their Independence Day. I also express thanks to the Secretary General for his pertinent briefing on the humanitarian and security situation in Ukraine, and join others in commending his direct involvement in the multiple mediation efforts aimed at getting the Russian Federation and Ukraine to cease their military hostilities and to positively engage in dialogue. I affirm in that regard Ghana's full support for the continuous deployment of the SG's good officers in helping to bring lasting peace to the people of Ukraine. Mr. President, the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the agreement on promoting the access of Russian food products and fertilizers to world markets, both secured under the auspices of the United Nations, with the active facilitation by other key actors, have proven that with persistent diplomacy, an acceptable political solution could be found to the ongoing military hostilities in Ukraine. Now more than ever, we must seize on the positive momentum generated by these two outcomes and intensify efforts to find other avenues to significantly diffuse the dangerously escalating tensions. Indeed, since the initially on July 27th and the subsequent implementation, the maritime humanitarian corridor in the Black Sea created by the initiative has enabled more than 500,000 metric tons of grain and other foodstuffs to be evacuated from Ukraine's southern ports to various parts of the world, which hitherto had been reeling under the threat of hunger and food insecurity. We urge the members of this council to overcome their persistent divide and work in a constructive manner to bring the weight of the council's authority in support of such initiatives. Mr. President, the mounting death toll and the destruction to economic infrastructure in Ukraine remain a matter of deep concern to Ghana. The deliberate targeting of nuclear facilities meant for peaceful purposes has further heightened our fears that a dangerous phase has begun in this senseless war. We stress the need for the parties to heed our genuine calls, including that of the international community, to end the war. Further, we urge the demilitarization of all the zones around Ukraine's nuclear facilities and affirm our support for international inspectors to be allowed access to the facilities in line with established norms. Beyond the fact that there is no military solution to the substantive security concerns of the parties, the war is unfortunately accentuating geopolitical tensions in many areas, exerting further strain on the already fragile international order. We share the conviction that any miscalculation could potentially result in a wider conflict in Europe, with long-term irreparable damage to the global peace and security architecture. We therefore continue to urge maximum restraint on the part of all the key actors and for an unconditional respect of the obligations imposed by the Charter. In that regard, we encourage all parties to the conflict to seek pacific settlement, as there should be no question about the need to respect international law, which underpins the current rules-based international order. Mr. President, in conclusion, we wish to underscore that it is crucial for the lives and safety of civilians, particularly women and children caught up in the ongoing war, to be prioritized above every other consideration. We therefore renew our call on the Russian Federation to withdraw all its invading troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine and pursue diplomacy and dialogue to resolve its legitimate security concerns. I thank you.
谢谢。下面请印度代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Secretary General for his comprehensive briefing on his visit to Ukraine last week. We thank USD DiCarlo for her intervention. I also join my Foreign Minister in conveying our greetings today to the people of Ukraine on the occasion of their Independence Day. As we meet to mark 6 months since the beginning of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, India is ready to dispatch its 12th consignment of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, consisting of 26 types of medicines, including hemostatic bandages meant to stem the bleeding of deep wounds in children and adults. This was a specific request by the Ukrainian side, and we have made sure that we will be reacting in the fastest possible time to meet this. In the last 6 months, India has dispatched 11 consignments of approximately 97.5 tons of humanitarian aid to Ukraine and neighboring countries such as Romania, Moldova, Slovakia, and Poland. Ukraine and its neighboring countries had offered their full support in the relief and evacuation operation of around 22,500 Indian nationals in February-March this year. This humanitarian aid and assistance symbolizes the human-centric development approach of the Government of India, a central tenet of our national beliefs and values, which perceives the whole world as one family. India remains deeply concerned over the situation in Ukraine. The conflict has resulted in loss of lives and countless miseries for its peoples, particularly for women, children, and the elderly, with millions becoming homeless and forced to take shelter in neighboring countries. We believe that going forward, we need to focus on the following aspects. 1. In terms of diplomacy, India continues to advocate for an immediate cessation of hostilities and an end to violence. We encourage talks between Ukraine and Russia. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has himself, more than once, spoken to them in this regard. 2. The ground situation calls for sustained prioritization of urgent humanitarian relief. I have just elaborated that we continue to give the highest priority to the requests that we receive in this regard. We also reiterate the importance of the UN guiding principles of humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian action must always be guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, that is, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should never be politicized. 3. We will work with the international community and partner countries to mitigate the economic hardships that are resulting from this conflict. The impact of the Ukraine conflict is not just limited to Europe, exacerbating concerns over food, fertilizer, and fuel security, particularly in the developing countries. 4. Food security remains a major concern. It is necessary for all of us to adequately appreciate the importance of equity, affordability, and accessibility when it comes to food grains. India has been approached for the supply of wheat and sugar by many countries, and we are responding positively. In the last 3 months alone, India has exported more than 1.8 million tons of wheat to countries in need, including to Afghanistan, Myanmar, Sudan, and Yemen. 5. We are also trying to increase the production of essential agrarian inputs like fertilizers in India. There is also a need to focus on the availability of fertilizers and keep the supply chains of fertilizers smooth at a global scale. 6. Efforts should be made to ensure stability in the global supply of fuel commensurate with demand. Open markets must not become an argument to perpetuate inequity and promote discrimination. 7. We have delivered for the world in terms of vaccines. We did it earlier for medicines. So I would like to assure this Council that India will step forward whenever the Global South is constrained on aspects of food, health and energy security, and we will do this in a manner that is helpful to the global economy and does not take undue advantage of countries in distress. To conclude, India's approach will be to promote dialogue and diplomacy with an overarching aim to end the conflict and work with other partners to mitigate the economic challenges emerging from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Mr. President, it is in our collective interest to work constructively, both inside the United Nations and outside, seeking an early resolution to this conflict. We continue to reiterate that the global order be anchored on international law, the UN Charter, and respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. Thank you.
谢谢印度代表的发言。下面我请俄罗斯代表发言。
Господин председатель, к выступлению президента Украины. Причина, по которой члены Совета в свое время решили избегать подключения зарубежных лидеров по видеосвязи, состоит еще и в стремлении избежать технических накладок, которые мы только что наблюдали в ходе выступления господина Зеленского. Уловить что-то из которого подчас было очень сложно. Надеемся, что наша позиция в пользу необходимости очного участия в заседаниях подобных приглашенных, хотя бы из уважения к ним, стало более понятно тем, кто следит за сегодняшним заседанием. Господин председатель, вчера мы собирались здесь в связи с конкретной угрозой международному миру и безопасности, продолжающимися бомбардировками Киева, Запорожской атомной электростанции, которые ставят Европу на грань ядерной катастрофы. Мы приняли к сведению разъяснение генерального секретаря, почему он не принял участие в вчерашнем заседании. Сегодняшняя же встреча формально вообще не привязана к развитию ситуации на Земле и призвана продемонстрировать неизменную поддержку западных делегаций любых действий киевского режима. Мы предсказуемо наслушались мантр про российскую агрессию. Как мы уже говорили, за последние 200 лет иных объяснений для проблем европейской безопасности, кроме как ссылок на действия России, на Западе так и не появилось. Наслушались мы сегодня и утверждения о катастрофических последствиях 6 месяцев военных действий для мирного населения Украины. Никто не спорит, украинцам сегодня приходится нелегко. Однако ответственность за это несет киевский режим, пришедший к власти в 2014 году в результате осуществленного при помощи ряда западных государств антиконституционного переворота. С самого начала новая майданная власть последовательно вела страну к катастрофе, взяв курс на русофобию и героизацию нацистских преступников. Таким образом, по самым скромным подсчетам, более 60% населения Украины оказались лишены возможности реализовать свою русскоязычную идентичность вопреки всем соответствующим международным конвенциям и обязательствам Украины. Западные же кураторы, ослепленные геополитической задачей ослабления России, изначально дали понять, что будут покрывать любые преступления киевской власти и закрывать глаза на то, чего никогда не допустили бы в собственных странах. В полной мере киевский режим проявил свою преступную сущность, когда живьем сжигал несогласных в Доме профсоюзов в Одессе и обрушил бомбы и снаряды на мирное население Донбасса. В этом бессмысленном крестовом походе против самой себя Украина потеряла Крым и спровоцировала вооруженный отпор со стороны дончан и луганчан, взявшихся за оружие во имя свободы и будущего своих детей. Эта война, уносившая жизни мирных жителей в течение 8 лет, могла бы закончиться, если бы Киев выполнил Минские договоренности. Однако ни украинским властям, ни их зарубежным покровителям это не было нужно. Они вновь открыто сказали об этом в начале этого года, пригрозив при этом отказаться от безъядерного статуса. В этих условиях для установления мира на Донбассе, а также для предотвращения исходящих от Украины очевидных угроз для России, у нас не оставалось иного выбора, кроме как начать спецоперацию по денацификации и демилитаризации Украины, цели которой успешно и последовательно выполняются. Еще раз повторю, если бы выполнялись Минские соглашения, никакой спецоперации не потребовалось бы. Но киевский режим решил иначе. Преступные обстрелы республик Донбасса не прекращаются. В Донецкой Народной Республике с начала февральского обострения на линии соприкосновения погибли, по оценкам, более 840 человек. Ранено около 2800. В Луганской Народной Республике 80 человек убиты, свыше 250 получили ранения. Около 100 гражданских лиц убито только за 4 недели с момента предыдущего заседания 29 июля. ВСУ целенаправленно уничтожают гражданскую инфраструктуру, включая детские сады, школы и медучреждения, линии электропередач и газопроводы. Не щадят даже те города Донбасса, которые еще недавно находились под их контролем, как, например, Лисичанск. А наши бывшие западные партнеры, вместо того, чтобы осудить своих украинских подопечных, поставляют им все новые и новые типы вооружений, добивающих туда, куда до этого Киев дотянуться не мог. Таким образом, они становятся соучастниками преступлений против мирного населения, а учитывая, что использование некоторых артиллерийских систем, как признаются сами украинцы, невозможно без согласования целей с поставщиками, становится еще и соисполнителем. Это в первую очередь касается американских РСЗО «Хаймерс», с помощью которых, в частности, был нанесен удар по исправительной колонии в Еленовке 29 июля, стоившей жизни более чем 50 украинским военнопленным. Мы знаем, что президент Украины прекрасно осведомлен о том, что за этим преступлением стоят вооруженные силы Украины, несмотря на то, что сегодня продавал нам лживую версию о причастности к этому России. Господин председатель, мы с самого начала предупреждали о том, что украинские вооруженные формирования активно используют гражданские объекты в военных целях. При этом местным жителям запрещено покидать свои дома, а все их попытки самостоятельно эвакуироваться в безопасные районы жестко пресекаются. Фактов расположения украинской артиллерии и боеприпасов на территории образовательных и медицинских учреждений за эти полгода накопилось столько, что их уже не могут игнорировать даже прозападные правозащитные организации, в частности, Amnesty International. Однако вместо того, чтобы заставить Киев соблюдать международное гуманитарное право, наши западные коллеги после истерики украинских властей, привыкших, что им все сходит с рук, предпочли устроить публичную порку как раз Amnesty International. Вот и сегодня госпожа Ди Карло нашла слова для того, чтобы выразить озабоченность в связи с предстоящим судом над нацистами и садистами из Азова, но ни слова не сказала об их ужасающих преступлениях и нарушениях международного гуманитарного права, включая зверские пытки, информация о которых у международных чиновников, включая ООН, который госпожа Карло сейчас представляет, предостаточно. В том числе и ООН, который госпожа Ди Карло сейчас представляет, предостаточно. Выглядит все это, честно говоря, крайне цинично и беспринципно и девальвирует продвигаемые Западом ценности свободы слова и защиты прав человека. Жаль, что вы этого не понимаете. Зато это хорошо понимают простые украинцы, сталкивающиеся со зверствами ВСУ и Нацбатов и их бесчеловечными методами. Приведу здесь только один пример. На заседании в июле мы уже показывали вам фото противопехотной мины «Лепесток». Сегодня для большей наглядности продемонстрирую вам учебный макет такой мины, которую украинские войска сотнями разбрасывают в Донбассе на освобожденных российской армией территориях и даже закидывают на территорию России. Представьте, что такой вот неприметный лепесток лежит на земле среди травы. Он может быть и камуфляжного цвета, что делает его практически невидимым на земле. Учитывая, что ВСУ разбрасывают эти мины в городах и селах далеко в тылу, они представляют угрозу вовсе не для солдат. Нет, они специально рассчитаны на мирных жителей, в особенности на детей, которые рискуют наступить или из любопытства взять в руки такую игрушку. Всего в ДНР зафиксировано уже 47 случаев подрыва на таких минах. Лепесток – живое свидетельство садистского и изуверского характера киевского режима, символ его реального отношения к народу Востока и юго-востока страны. Разумеется, люди это видят и понимают. Отсюда и отношение к российским солдатам как к освободителям, повсеместно распространенное на освобожденных территориях. Это никак не вписывается в нарратив, продвигаемый Киевом, и его западными спонсорами. Поэтому Украина прибегает к тактике террора и запугивания в Херсонской, Запорожской и Харьковской областях. Но настроение людей, увидевших реальное лицо киевской власти, это изменить не может. Киев проигрывает борьбу за умы, а его западные спонсоры, ведущие на Украине войну по доверенности с Россией до последнего украинца, все глубже погрязают в поддержке антинародного, античеловечного режима, закрывая глаза на проявление неонацизма, крайнего национализма и русофобии. При этом еще и стреляют себе в ногу тщетными попытками изолировать Россию политически и экономически. Впрочем, за это вам отчитываться перед своими избирателями и налогоплательщиками. Как и отвечать перед международной общественностью за беспрецедентную и лживую кампанию по дискредитации России, которую вы развязали. Никогда еще после геббельсовской нацистской пропаганды мир не сталкивался с подобным уровнем фальсификации и подтасовок, которые продвигают западные и украинские специалисты по психологическим операциям. Не сомневаюсь, что история даст им правильную оценку. Наш албанский коллега вещал нам сегодня в стиле аль-Альбанес про российских заключенных, которых якобы рекрутирует российская власть. Но забыл упомянуть о выпущенных из украинских тюрем украинских заключенных, которым раздали оружие в самые первые дни специальной военной операции, и которые прославились мародерством и убийствами, и которые до сих пор продолжают терроризировать украинские города. Мы подробно остановимся на этом на одном из будущих заседаний. Господин председатель, своего рода историей успеха принято считать так называемую Черноморскую инициативу Генерального секретаря ООН, особенно в части, касающейся беспрепятственного вывоза продовольствия из Украины. Однако и здесь есть настораживающие тенденции. За 4 недели экспортных операций из 34 сухогрузов только один направился в Африку. Это совершенно не вяжется с изначально заявленными целями борьбы с голодом в странах, остро нуждающихся в зерновых. Здесь, конечно, стоит вспомнить имиджевый провал при отправке судна первопроходца «Разони», который по факту привезло в Ливан не пшеницу, которую там ждали, а кукурузу и при этом фуражную. На этом фоне много размышлений вызывает комментарий генерального секретаря в порту Одессы 19 августа о том, что вывоз зерновых и снижение цен на глобальных рынках продовольствия не принесут облегчения нуждающимся странам, которые все равно не могут позволить себе его купить. Эта ситуация со всей очевидностью раскрывает истинные причины проблем с глобальной продбезопасностью. Дело здесь совершенно не в украинском зерне. Главная причина – собственные экономические просчеты западных стран и последствия антироссийских санкций, о которых мы неоднократно говорили в этом зале. Именно санкции из-за разрыва логистических и финансовых цепочек спровоцировали резкий спад предложения на рынках. Оправданиями о якобы таргетированном характере односторонних мер людей не накормишь. Призываем всех причастных со всей серьезностью отнестись к пакетному характеру Черноморской инициативы и не откладывать решение финансовых и логистических проблем, препятствующих экспорту российского продовольствия и удобрений на мировой рынок. Подчеркиваем, что продлению зерновой сделки, срок которой 120 дней со дня подписания, будут способствовать осязаемые результаты для российских внешнеэкономических операторов, эквивалентные тому, что мы видим для украинского экспорта. Пока в этой части зерновой сделки есть существенный резерв. Господин председатель, не секрет, что сегодняшнее заседание, запросившие его западные коллеги, хотели обязательно приурочить ко Дню независимости Украины. Сегодня об этом было сказано достаточно много. Ряд наших коллег прямо указывает на Россию как на угрозу украинской независимости. Не согласимся с этим. Спустя 8 лет после запуска Майданного проекта стало очевидно, что главная, по сути, единственная угроза независимости Украины – это нынешняя киевская власть. За эти годы сформировались заметные невооруженным взглядом и глазом прочные механизмы внешнего управления Украиной. Мы знаем, что на всех уровнях власти, во всех ключевых ведомствах этой страны присутствуют западные советники, без согласия которых не принимается ни одно серьезное решение. Достаточно вспомнить, как в 2014 году небезызвестная Виктория Нуланд решала с американским послом в Киеве по телефону вопросы формирования украинского правительства. Или вспомнить нынешнего президента Соединенных Штатов Джо Байдена, который хвалился тем, что грубым шантажом добился снятия генерального прокурора Украины. Если это независимость, то что тогда зависимость? И есть ли что украинцам праздновать в этот день? За время правления Зеленского и особенно с 24 февраля в стране была окончательно зачищена оппозиция, подавлены инакомыслие, закрыты оппозиционные СМИ. Люди преследуются и арестовываются, и сажаются в тюрьму только за то, что читали русскоязычные новости и смотрели телеканалы. А теперь еще, в соответствии с новым законом о коллаборационизме, еще и за то, что они принимают гуманитарную помощь из России. Украина окончательно превратилась в дремучую, безжалостную антироссию и уверенно движется к своему полному идейному и политическому банкротству. Чтобы оценить степень этой глубочайшей русофобской деградации, я хочу еще раз процитировать слова, сказанные на днях послом Украины в Казахстане Петром Врублевским. После убийства Дарьи Дугиной он в открытую заявил, цитирую, «Стараемся их убить как можно больше. Чем больше мы убьем русских сейчас, тем меньше придется убивать нашим детям». Вот и все. Конец цитаты. И это говорит посол страны, в которой эти самые русские не просто живут, но и составляют весьма значительную часть населения. Есть ли будущее у такой страны, у такого бесчеловечного режима? Наши западные коллеги могут затянуть его агонию, но не предотвратить его фиаско. Поэтому в завершении хотел бы пожелать братскому украинскому народу обрести, наконец, свободу и получить возможность строить такое общество, которое уважало бы элементарные права человека и национальную идентичность и жило бы в мире со своими соседями. Этот час уже близок, как бы ни старался киевский режим и его западные покровители. Благодарю вас.
感谢俄罗斯代表的发言，下面请墨西哥代表发言。
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Señor presidente, mi delegación agradece al secretario general y a la secretaria general adjunta por sus presentaciones. Hemos escuchado con gran interés y profundo respeto la intervención del presidente Zelensky de Ucrania, cuya independencia celebramos hoy, mañana y siempre. También hemos seguido con mucho cuidado, con mucha atención, las recientes visitas del secretario general a Ucrania y a Turquía. Reconocemos su liderazgo y sus esfuerzos que han llevado a importantes acuerdos para limitar el impacto de la crisis de alimentos y devolvernos la esperanza. En ese sentido, nos congratulamos de que la iniciativa de granos del Mar Negro siga operando de manera regular y que ello permita que 720,000 toneladas métricas de grano puedan tener acceso a los mercados alrededor del mundo, así como el abastecimiento del Programa Mundial de Alimentos. Todo esto parece estar teniendo, al fin, un efecto estabilizador importante. México considera que los avances en el marco de esta iniciativa de granos del Mar Negro es un gran hito diplomático en tiempos de conflicto armado. En este sentido, quisiera reconocer también la importantísima labor del presidente de Turquía en la obtención de este acuerdo. Exhortamos una vez más a todas las partes, en especial a aquellas que tienen capacidad de influencia, a no escatimar esfuerzos para mantener abiertos los canales de comunicación que permitan establecer un diálogo para poner fin a las hostilidades. Pero pese a estos avances, es claro que el sistema multilateral, y en particular este Consejo de Seguridad, no ha sido capaz de poner fin a esta guerra. La invasión a un país soberano, Ucrania, por parte de Rusia, constituye una flagrante violación del artículo 2.4 de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Cualquier adquisición territorial obtenida por el uso ilegal de la fuerza es nula y carente de toda validez. Es necesario poner fin a la guerra y con ello a las numerosas violaciones del derecho internacional y especialmente del derecho internacional humanitario. 6 meses de bombardeos a hospitales, a escuelas, a zonas residenciales, a infraestructura civil básica incluyendo la central de Zaporizhia y la destrucción del patrimonio cultural. 6 meses de violaciones a los métodos y medios de conducción de las hostilidades, de violación a los derechos humanos, incluyendo la perpetración de violencia sexual y de género, de uso de armas con efectos indiscriminados, como las municiones en racimo o las minas. Exhortamos de la manera más enfática a poner fin a estos ataques, en especial a aquellos dirigidos contra la población civil y a los ataques indiscriminados. Asimismo, llamamos a las partes a cumplir con los principios de distinción, proporcionalidad y precaución en la conducción de las hostilidades. Expresamos nuestro más amplio apoyo a las labores de investigación que realizan tanto el fiscal de la Corte Penal Internacional, así como para el establecimiento de una misión de determinación de los hechos sobre los presuntos crímenes de guerra ocurridos en Olenivka. La rendición de cuentas es un pilar fundamental de nuestro sistema multilateral y los responsables de los crímenes que se han cometido y se cometan en Ucrania deberán ser llevados ante la justicia. Señor presidente, México reitera su honda preocupación por la amenaza que representan los flujos ilícitos y el tráfico de armas a la región. Es necesario mantener una vigilancia sobre el ciclo completo de vida de las armas, desde su transferencia, pasando por la intermediación y concluyendo en quienes resultan ser los usuarios finales. Debemos orientar las acciones para evitar que las armas caigan en manos de quienes nunca deberían tenerlas, especialmente cuando las hostilidades han concluido. El trabajo de México en este Consejo seguirá enfocado en avanzar y cimentar la construcción de la paz en Ucrania. En esta línea, quisiera reiterar nuestro llamado urgente a negociar un cese a las hostilidades y a buscar la solución por la vía del diálogo y la diplomacia. Concluyo reafirmando nuestro apoyo a la independencia, soberanía e integridad territorial de Ucrania dentro de sus fronteras internacionalmente reconocidas. Son principios consagrados en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y todos los aquí presentes nos comprometimos a respetarlos y a hacerlos respetar. Muchas gracias.
我感谢墨西哥代表的发言。我现在以中国代表的身份发言。各位同事，中方在乌克兰问题上的立场是一贯的、明确的。我们始终主张，各国主权、领土完整都应该得到尊重，联合国宪章宗旨和原则都应该得到遵守。 各国合理安全关切都应该得到重视，一切有利于和平解决危机的努力都应该得到支持。然而，乌克兰危机还在延续，战事还在扩大，外溢影响还在蔓延，和平的前景还没有出现。国际社会迫切希望 早日恢复和平，也期待安理会能够为此发挥应有的作用。应该反思的是，安理会是否找到了解决问题的正确方向，是否为缓和局势付出了切实努力。中方愿同所有爱好和平的国家一道，致力于劝和促谈， 推动局势缓和降温。当务之急，我们认为应该从以下几点着手： 第一，要为冲突设置安全阀。国际人道法应当成为冲突当事方的行为准则。平民和民用设施不能作为军事打击的目标。最近针对扎波罗热核电站的频繁袭击，引发广泛关切和担忧，给世界投下了核阴影。中方再次呼吁有关当事方保持克制、谨慎行事，避免采取危及核设施安全和安保的行动，守好核安全的红线。我们也期待国际原子能机构能够早日对扎波罗热核电站开展实地访问，对形势做出专业技术评估，以利于采取后续措施，防范核灾难的发生。第二，要全力减少人道冲击。国际社会既要努力帮助乌克兰难民和流离失所者渡过难关，也要尽力减轻冲突对全球粮食、能源、金融稳定造成的冲击。中方赞赏古特雷斯秘书长和有关各方为促成粮食外运协议签署做出的努力。高兴地看到已有20多艘粮船、70多万吨粮食从乌克兰运往世界各地，这对平抑粮价上涨势头、稳定国际粮食市场、缓解发展中国家粮食短缺发挥了重要作用。消除俄罗斯粮食化肥面临的出口障碍同样十分重要。希望联合国能够根据同俄罗斯签署的备忘录，推动解决有关国家滥施制裁带来的寒蝉效应，保障全球产业链供应链稳定畅通运行。发展中国家正处在困难时期，削减官方发展援助无异于雪上加霜。发达国家应当正视由此造成的人道影响，采取负责任的政策措施。第三，要给外交解决留出路。和平从来不是靠制裁施压、输送武器得来的，而是需要各方共同争取和维护。无论形势多复杂，分析多严峻，外交对话的大门都不能关上。粮食外运问题取得积极进展，让我们看到了外交努力的潜力和政治解决的可能。希望俄乌双方继续保持对话沟通，争取早日重返外交谈判，为停火止战不断积累势头和条件。美国和北约应该好好反思自身角色，将精力和重点放到真正有利于促进和平的事情上来，而不是拱火浇油。各位同事，乌克兰危机和最近国际上发生的一系列紧张事态表明，在这个迫切需要团结合作、共迎挑战的时代，必须高度警惕任何蓄意挑衅、加剧分裂对抗的企图，守护好全球战略稳定，绝不允许世界滑向新冷战。事实证明，冷战思维、集团对抗坚决要不得。冷战结束30多年，北约一再东扩，非但没有让欧洲更安全，反而埋下冲突的种子。 人类是不可分割的安全共同体，实现共同安全最符合各国共同利益。一国安全不能以损害他国安全为代价，地区安全也不能以强化军事集团来保障。在21世纪的今天，冷战思维、零和博弈早已过时，迷信军事武力，谋求绝对安全，只会导致地区局势轮番升级，不符合任何一方利益。事实证明，脱钩断链、选边站队坚决要不得。各国经济已经深度融合，少数国家大肆出台单边制裁和长臂管辖，将经贸科技政治化、武器化，大搞脱钩断链、小院高墙，进一步加剧发展中国家的民生困难，威胁全球粮食、能源、金融安全。发展中国家没有责任为地缘冲突和大国博弈埋单，也有权利独立自主决定自身的对外政策，不应该被强迫选边站队。事实证明，双重标准选择适用坚决要不得。遵守联合国宪章宗旨和原则，尊重主权和领土完整，不应只是口头引用，而应在实践中真正落实，在不同国家、不同问题上一以贯之，言行合一。对于国家主权和领土完整，中国人民有着真实而深刻的理解和感受。中方一贯尊重他国主权和领土完整，也必将坚决维护自身主权和领土完整。乌克兰危机是对我们这一代人维护和平能力的重大考验。站在历史的十字路口，是要和平还是要动荡？要合作还是要对抗？要进步还是要倒退？我们必须做出无愧于历史、无愧于人民的选择。我现在恢复行使安理会主席的职责。我现在请欧洲联盟驻联合国代表团临时代办贡扎托先生阁下发言。
Thank you. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its 27 member states. The candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, and the Republic of Moldova, the country of the stabilization and association process and potential candidate Bosnia-Herzegovina, Georgia, Andorra, and San Marino align themselves with this statement. President, we welcome today's discussion on Ukraine. It is essential that the Security Council remains seized of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. I thank the Secretary General and Under-Secretary General Di Carlo for their briefings and welcome the intervention by President Zelensky at this meeting. First of all, let me congratulate Ukraine on the 31st anniversary of its independence. The fact that today also marks the 6th month since Russia's unprovoked and illegal aggression provides a stark reminder that independence can never be taken for granted. The EU recognizes the tremendous courage displayed by Ukraine and its people in defense of its independence. As the Under-Secretary General told us, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has verified over 13,000 civilian casualties since Russia's attack, with the true numbers being considerably higher. We express our deepest sympathy to the families of the victims and reaffirm our commitment to continuing our support to Ukraine in any way we can. The EU reiterates its strongest condemnation for the continued violation by Russia of the UN Charter, as well as its disregard of the United Nations General Assembly resolutions adopted in March this year by an overwhelming majority of UN members. We also deplore Russia's failure to comply with the legally binding order of the International Court of Justice to immediately cease its use of force against Ukraine. And we call upon the Russian Federation to comply with its obligation under international law, including the UN Charter, international humanitarian law, and human rights law. The perpetrators of war crimes and of other serious violations, as well as the responsible government officials and military representatives, will be held accountable. The EU actively supports all measures to ensure accountability for human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law committed during the Russian aggression in Ukraine. President, the past months we have seen an emerging risk of nuclear calamity in Europe. It is deplorable that we even need to say that a nuclear power plant should never be used as a military base. The deployment of Russian military personnel and weaponry at the nuclear facility is unacceptable and disregards the safety, security, and safeguard principles that all IAEA members have committed to respect. We urge the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw its military forces and all other unauthorized personnel from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and its immediate surroundings, so that the operator and Ukrainian authorities can resume their sovereign responsibilities within Ukraine's international recognized borders, and so that the legitimate operating staff can conduct their duties without outside interference, threat, or unacceptably harsh working conditions. An IAEA mission urgently needs to enter the power plant to address nuclear safety, security, and safeguard concerns in a manner that respects full Ukrainian sovereignty and its control over its territory and infrastructure. IAEA staff must be able to access all nuclear facilities in Ukraine safely and without impediment, and engage directly and without interference with Ukrainian personnel responsible for the operation of these facilities. The global implications of Russia's aggression are well documented, Mr. President. We support the UN's Global Crisis Response Group, launched in the aftermath of Russia's invasion with a view to addressing rocketing food and energy prices. We welcome the progress made in implementing the Black Sea Grain Initiative and reiterate our gratitude to the Secretary General and Turkey for facilitating its agreement, and acknowledge the positive role played by other actors, such as the African Union leadership, in coming to an arrangement. We call for continued strict implementation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative with a view to addressing rising food prices globally. With our Solidarity Lanes initiative, aimed at boosting exports from Ukraine over land, the EU is proud to have contributed to increasing Ukrainian exports of cereals, oilseeds, and related products from 1.3 million tons in April to 2.8 million tons in July. We're also supporting agricultural production and resilience in the most affected countries. The EU welcomes the active involvement of the Secretary General. His recent visit to Ukraine and Istanbul demonstrate his dedication to address this crisis, and the EU will continue to support his efforts and those of his staff, including the Joint Coordination Center. We welcome the Secretary General's calls to demilitarize the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, as well as the establishment of a fact-finding mission to investigate the incident in a detention facility in Olenivka. President, in conclusion, the UN's member states reaffirmed their commitment to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its international recognized borders and extending to its territorial sea. President, this war is senseless. The humanitarian consequences for millions of civilians are disastrous. Russia could end it tomorrow if it wanted. Until that happens, human lives are wasted and the war's global fallout continues at a time in history where we should focus on the planetary crises which are impacting us all. This is why we reiterate our demand for the immediate cessation of the military aggression against Ukraine by the Russian Federation, as well as for the full, immediate and unconditional withdrawal of its forces and military equipment from Ukraine's territory. In the meantime, we wish to assure our partners around the world that the EU will continue to demonstrate its global solidarity to address the impacts of Russia's aggression, especially on the most vulnerable. I thank you.
我感谢欧盟代表的发言。现在发言名单上没有其他人了。现在休会。
Nothing, they are not contacting, not negotiating. President Zelensky is saying that the condition to negotiate is full Russian withdrawal from the territory of Ukraine, and that does not limit, he does not limit it to the current status, but to the previous one as well. Now he's saying that if there is a tribunal over the criminals from Azov in Mariupol, that will close the road to negotiations, and he lost appetite to negotiations very early in the conflict, very early on in the conflict after the heavy Western support with armaments that followed from the West. And we clearly see no appetite for negotiations from him now as well, which was proved by what he was saying today at today's meeting.
Ambassador, the UN is saying that they are waiting for assurances from both Russia and Ukraine for the IAEA visit to take place. Is Russia ready to give those assurances? What are your conditions for this visit?
We said it from day one that we are prepared to give assurances for what we are responsible for. We cannot give assurances on behalf of Ukrainians. And given that the station is being shelled by the Ukrainian side, which is fait accompli, despite what they are saying about it, we cannot guarantee it on their behalf. We can guarantee on our behalf that we can provide security in an area where we are responsible.
Do you think it can happen soon, the mission?
The sooner the better. Hopefully early August, late August, early September, but that depends on the result of the negotiations between you and us in Ukraine. Thank you.
Do you have any opinion on this idea of a permanent presence of the IAEA?
I'm not a nuclear specialist, but I would personally welcome it. Let's see how the parties, to what the parties will agree. Thank you.
Yes, of course. All right, how are you, all of you? We will wait for a moment to allow my dear colleagues to join. drines. Well, in fact, it's a very good thing to tell that there are so many of us that we need to squeeze. We will not squeeze, however, we will expand in support of Ukraine, believe me. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for being here this afternoon. And I would like to read this joint statement. The following is a joint statement by Albania, Andorra, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Canada, Colombia, Croatia, Republic of Cyprus, Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Guatemala, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Marshall Islands, Monaco, Montenegro, the Netherlands, New Zealand, North Macedonia, Norway, Palau, Poland, Portugal, Republic of Moldova, Republic of Korea, Romania, San Marino, Singapore, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Switzerland, Turkey, Ukraine, the Federated States of Micronesia, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the European Union. Today marks 6 months since the beginning of Russia's unprovoked, full-scale, and illegal invasion of Ukraine. We recall the UN General Assembly's resounding conclusions that the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine is a violation of the UN Charter that impacts not only the people of Ukraine, but millions of people around the world. We deplore the Russian Federation's failure to implement UN General Assembly Resolution A/ES/11/1 of the 2nd of March 2022 and the Resolution A/ES/11/2 of the 24th of March 2022, as well as its failure to comply with the legally binding order by the International Court of Justice of 16th of March 2022, in particular, its failure to immediately cease its use of force against Ukraine. All states have an obligation under Article 2 of the Charter of the United Nations to refrain in their international relations from the threat of use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state and to settle their international disputes by peaceful means. No territorial acquisition resulting from the threat or use of force shall be recognized as lawful. We call upon the Russian Federation to stop its total disregard of its obligations under international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, international humanitarian law, and the international human rights law. Today, we reaffirm our solidarity with the people of Ukraine, pay tribute to all those who have sacrificed their lives for the independence of Ukraine, and express our deepest sympathy and condolences to the families of the victims of the ongoing aggression against Ukraine. We condemn in the strongest terms sustained missile strikes by the Russian armed forces on the territory of Ukraine, which have repeatedly hit residential areas and civilian infrastructure, resulting in harms to displacement and deaths of thousands of civilians during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We remain committed to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, extending to its territorial waters. Today, once again, we reiterate our demand for the immediate cessation of hostilities by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, of all attacks directed against civilians and civilian infrastructure, and the full, immediate, and unconditional withdrawal of the Russian forces and military equipment from the territory of Ukraine. End of statement. Thank you.
Just ask.
It's the discretion of my colleagues and their availability.
We just asked, well, the Russian ambassador just came out and showed a mine that he said was planted in Russian-occupied territory by the Ukrainians. I wondered whether you had any response to that, and we also asked whether we were going to be back here in a year doing a first anniversary, and he said basically he wasn't a magician, couldn't prognosticate.
Right, I speak on my own behalf, so it doesn't mean that all of our colleagues may share my opinion. It is a very private opinion. My private opinion is that I would be very much surprised that Ambassador Nebenza lasts for another year in New York for many reasons. When it comes to allegations, all allegations should be investigated. Therefore, Ukraine cooperates with all relevant international structures to investigate all atrocities and all allegations about war crimes committed in the territory of Ukraine in the course of this invasion. But let me remind you as well that the war against Ukraine did not start on the 24th of February, European time. The war against Ukraine started in the year 2014. And everything should be investigated. And I hope that the Russian Federation cooperates with the international investigation. Thank you.
Is Ukraine ready to welcome the IAEA inspection team? And are there any conditions that Ukraine has for them to access the plant?
Ukraine repeated it many, many times, including yesterday, that Ukraine insists that there is not only the International Atomic Energy Agency mission, that there is a permanent presence of the agency in the territory of the NPP until the NPP is fully handed over to Ukrainian control. There is an exchange of letters between the Director General and the Foreign Minister Kuleba. The last letter he sent was yesterday, in reply to the letter of the Director General of the 17th of August. And in that letter, we expressed our practical agreement with the intentions of the agencies. And we are very much encouraged that there is an overwhelming understanding that the inspection should be conducted in full accordance with the Ukrainian national legislation and international law.
Can I have a question, please?
Can you identify yourself, please?
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. Sir, how can you justify the position of your government supporting the aggression of Israel on the Palestinians, killing their children, annexing their land, building settlement against UN resolutions?
I think that you are misconstructing the position of my government, and I will not reply to the false allegations that are not based on the facts and on the policy of Ukraine with regard to the two-state solution in the Middle East.
Ambassador, did you get a reaction from the UN to your call for permanent presence of the IAEA mission in Ukraine?
The discussion is ongoing in Vienna, where the headquarters of the International Atomic Energy Agency is.
Ambassador, Mariam Ramadi from Iran International. What do you think about Iran selling drones to Russia to be used in Ukraine war?
Any support of the aggressive actions of Russia will be detrimental to the national interests of every single country on the planet.
Japanese news agency. What if Russia wanted to say they want to start the peace talk? Would you be willing to go back to the diplomacy?
I do not discuss hypotheses or theories or conspiracies, but the position of the government of Ukraine and of the president of Ukraine when it comes to any talks with the Russians is well known. You can easily find it on the website of the President of Ukraine. The only thing I would like to say that if the Russians will go ahead with their theatrical court and against the members of Azov battalion, it may mean the point of no return when it comes to the possibility of peace talks with the Russians.
Your president mentioned a potential GA resolution. Is there anything more that you can share on that?
Yeah, I think that the issue of accountability is very prominent here in New York, and there is a very powerful sentiment among the membership that impunity and accountability should be addressed, including in the form of necessary decisions in New York. So we are working very hard with many countries, and that will be our joint proposal when the time comes. All right, thank you very much, and smile, please. I mean, if you are depressed or not happy, it only helps our adversaries, so be happy. Thank you. All right.
Happy Independence Day.
Everybody will say anything.
Sergey, so we go this way or that way?
Be there in
The president talked about an attack today on railroad.
Right, yes.
We couldn't, because of the sound, we couldn't
Right.
hear what he said
I'm sure
about
that
casualties.
Right, I don't know. I mean, I have to verify the full text with his official website. So I will go myself on the website of the president to check on the latest text. Right? Shall I believe in the victory?
Could I also ask to my question? Can you clarify? Are you saying that unless there's a permanent mission, the team can't come in?
No.
Is that part? That's not okay. I just wanted to be sure. Okay.
We are open to the mission. We believe that it is desirable that they stay there as long as possible.
Okay. Thank you for.